Imagine watching your wife get led away by the most powerful man on the planet. You can't do a thing. You can't say a word. All around you, 50 senators are just as frozen, knowing that in 20 minutes, their entire world could just end. This isn't some messed up dream. This is what it's like having dinner with Emperor Caligula. And what he's about to do is going to prove that the worst monsters aren't born, they're made. If you believe the darkest stories in history are the ones we have to remember, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. Your support is what lets us dig up these stories that show us everything about power, cruelty, and what it takes to survive. Now let me show you how one guy turned an entire empire into a machine built to break the human soul. How Rome's most twisted emperor engineered a machine to shatter the human soul. The senator just watches, his wife led away by the emperor of Rome. His hands are glued to his wine cup. Around him, 50 other powerful men sit like statues, each one praying his own family makes it through the night. 20 minutes stretch into an eternity. When Caligula finally brings her back, he doesn't just walk her over to her husband. Oh no. He sits back down, pours himself another glass, and then in front of every single person who matters in Rome, he starts describing, with the cold graphic precision of a surgeon, exactly what he just did to her behind those doors. The senator's friends all stare down at their plates. His wife stares at nothing at all, and he has to smile. He has to nod along. He has to thank the emperor for the honor, because the only other option is to go home and find his children have been dealt with. This wasn't the work of some lunatic. This was a calculated move, a system engineered with surgical accuracy designed to tear a man's soul apart from the inside. And the man who designed this whole nightmare learned everything he knew watching his own family get systematically butchered by the emperor who came before him. His name was Caligula, and in less than 4 years he would teach Rome a terrifying lesson about power that it could never, ever forget. But this story really starts 30 years earlier, back when the monster was just a little boy playing dress-up in armor that was way too big for him. The year is 14 AD. There's this little kid, maybe 6 or 7 years old, tearing through a Roman military camp in a custom-made legionnaire outfit. Tiny armor, tiny red boots. They called them Caligulae, and a little wooden sword bouncing on his hip. And the soldiers? They absolutely adored him. We're talking about the toughest men on earth guys who conquered half the world and fought barbarian tribes in frozen forests. And here they are picking this kid up, tossing him in the air, and letting him inspect the troops. They nicknamed him Caligula. Little Boots. He was the son of Germanicus, the most beloved general Rome had seen since Julius Caesar himself. And wherever his dad went, Little Boots was right there with him. The soldiers, they were superstitious. They really believed this kid was their good luck charm. When they marched, he marched. When they set up camp, he got his own tiny tent right next to his father's command post. He was growing up thinking he was untouchable, adored by everyone, and protected by the most lethal army on the planet. He had absolutely no clue what was waiting for him just around the corner. 1 year later, his father is dead. The official report says it was a sudden illness, but the whispers, the story that everyone believed but nobody was dumb enough to say out loud, was poison, an order that came from someone real close to the Emperor Tiberius, maybe from Tiberius himself. Caligula is just 8 years old when the imperial machine begins to grind up his family one by one. First they came for his mother. Soldiers dragged her out of their house in the dead of night. The charge was treason. No proof, no trial. Just accusations and chains. They shipped her off to a prison island, where she was left to slowly starve to death over years. Next was his oldest brother. They arrested him on trumped-up charges, tossed him in a dark cell, and refused him food until he got so desperate he tried to eat the stuffing from his own mattress. He died, choking on it. His second brother was exiled to some barren rock in the middle of the Mediterranean. The guards there had their fun with him day after day, until he finally ended it himself by smashing his own head against the stone walls of his prison. One after another they were just erased, and Caligula saw it all happen. From the sidelines, a ghost in the palace, completely powerless, kept alive only because no one saw a young boy as a threat. By the time he was 19, he was the only one left, the last survivor of a noble bloodline. And that's when the message arrived. Emperor Tiberius wanted to see him on the island of Capri. Now Capri is a gorgeous island, but Tiberius had turned it into his own private hell. It was a fortress far from the prying eyes of Rome, far from the Senate, far from anyone who could judge what he did there. The old historians, they talk about Capri like it was a house of horrors. Tiberius had grown paranoid, twisted, surrounding himself with fortune-tellers and sycophants, getting his kicks by inventing new ways to torture people, just because he was bored. And into this living nightmare walks a teenage Caligula. He knows with absolute certainty that this is the man who murdered his entire family. But he can't let it show, not for a second. One wrong look, one flicker of sadness in his eyes, one moment of anger, and he'd end up in an unmarked grave, just like his brothers. So he did more than just survive there. He thrived. He took every human part of himself, the grief, the rage, the fear, and he buried it so deep no one could ever find it. He watched Tiberius. He studied him. He became the perfect courtier, obedient, charming, and completely harmless. For 6 long years he played that part without a single mistake, learning the art of cruelty from a true master. Then in 37 AD, Tiberius finally died. Some say it was old age. The whispers say Caligula helped him along with a pillow. Either way, in the blink of an eye, the 19-year-old hostage was now the single most powerful man in the known world. Rome went absolutely wild with joy. They thought they were getting the son of their hero, Germanicus. They remembered the sweet little boy in the red boots, who made the legions smile. They were about to find out that they had just handed the keys to the world to something else entirely. Something that had spent 6 years in a monster's shadow taking notes. For 7 months, it was perfect. A dream come true. Caligula freed political prisoners. He threw massive games and festivals for the people. He spoke to the Senate with respect and humility. Rome breathed a collective sigh of relief, thinking it had been saved, and then he got sick, a raging fever that nearly killed him. He was out for days. When he finally woke up, something inside of him had cracked wide open, and it was never going back together again, and all of Rome was about to see what he'd been hiding behind that perfect, smiling mask. What came next wasn't just random acts of a madman. No, Caligula built a system, a 5-phase program of psychological warfare, with each phase designed to systematically dismantle a different piece of the human spirit. And the truly terrifying part, it was all by design. Phase 1 started with his sister Drusilla. Caligula had 3 sisters, but Drusilla, she was special to him. The ancient writers claim their relationship went to places that even a city as permissive as Rome found deeply unsettling. Now, whether those rumors were true or just nasty gossip, it didn't really matter. What mattered is that everybody believed them, and Caligula never did a single thing to make them think otherwise. Then Drusilla died. Maybe it was the fever, maybe something else. The official cause is irrelevant, because what Caligula did next shows you his whole playbook. He would take his own private pain and make it the public's problem. He didn't just mourn her, he weaponized his grief. First, he forced the Senate to officially declare Drusilla a goddess. I'm not speaking metaphorically. She was now by law divine. Temples were built in her name, and Roman citizens were required to go and worship his dead sister. Then he declared a national period of mourning. And this is where it gets truly monstrous. It was now a crime, punishable by death, to laugh. It was a capital offense to take a bath. It was illegal to have a simple dinner with your own family. Just let that sink in for a second. For weeks, maybe even months, if you were caught smiling at a joke, you could be killed for it. If your kid says something funny at the dinner table, what do? Do you laugh? Do you scream at them for being a child? Every single moment of normal human joy was now a potential death sentence. Spies were everywhere. Neighbors turned on neighbors. The entire Roman Empire was forced to perform an act of grief they didn't feel for a woman they'd never even met. Caligula was making an entire empire feel his agony, whether they liked it or not. He was discovering that he could pass laws against emotions, that he could outlaw happiness itself, that he could make his own internal hell, everyone else's reality. And once he figured out he could control how people felt, he started to wonder what else he could take from them. The next part of his story, it's so messed up that historians still argue if it even happened, or if it was just propaganda cooked up later to make everyone feel better about what they did to him. Caligula opens a house of ill repute right inside the imperial palace. But get this, it's not for him. It's for the public, a business venture, and the staff. Not your usual street workers. No, he fills it with the sons and daughters of Rome's most powerful families, the blue bloods, the senators, the guys who ran entire countries and led armies. He sends guys out into the streets to shout out the prices. Different price tags for married women versus single girls. A special upcharge for the untouched daughters of senators. And here's the part that's just pure calculated cruelty. He kept books, detailed ledgers, names, dates, what they paid, and exactly what services were rendered. It was the paperwork of pure humiliation. See, it wasn't enough to just break these families in the moment. He was creating a permanent record proof that would outlive every single person involved. In a world where your family name was everything, where your reputation decided your kids' futures, he was building a library of shame. Fathers had to walk their own daughters to the palace doors. Mothers had to get their sons dressed and send them off to service complete strangers. Why? Because saying no meant you died, and not just you, your entire family gone in a single afternoon. And those ledgers, they had another purpose. They were his insurance policy. Every senator who walked through that door, every nobleman who took part, was now dirty. They were all in on it. They'd all helped trash the honor of Rome's elite. Suddenly nobody could stand up and claim to be the good guy. Nobody could start a rebellion without admitting they were part of the filth. It was genius in the most twisted, horrifying way you can imagine. Caligula had turned Rome's ruling class into partners in their own downfall. The third phase, that one happened over dinner. Caligula would throw these huge fancy banquets. Senators and their wives would show up in their best outfits, kicking back on couches around his table. The wine never stopped flowing. Music played. Servants brought out one expensive dish after another. On the surface, it just looked like a regular high-class Roman party. Then right in the middle of the meal, Caligula would point at a senator's wife. Sometimes he'd say something. Sometimes just a flick of the wrist was enough. And just like that, guards would appear at her side. They'd lead her out of the room while her husband just sat there, frozen the food in his mouth, tasting like ash. And the dinner would just keep going. The other guests would make small talk. Hey, this wine is great. You have to try the fish. They'd chat about the chariot races. What else could they do? Every minute that ticked by felt like an eternity. Finally, Caligula would come back with the woman. He wouldn't just slide back into his seat and pick up his fork. Oh no. He'd sit down, pour a fresh glass of wine, and start giving a play-by-play. A graphic, clinical, detailed account of exactly what had just gone down, what he did, what he made her do, how she reacted, if she cried, if she fought back, and her husband had to sit there and listen. He had to nod. He had to smile and thank the emperor for the honor of his attention, because if he showed a flicker of anger, he was dead. If he showed an ounce of pain, he was dead. The only thing you were allowed to feel was gratitude. This was never about lust. This was about absolute power. This was about forcing men to watch their own humiliation, to smile, while their dignity was carved away piece by painful piece, until there was nothing left. Caligula was showing them that they owned nothing. Not their honor, not their wives, not even their own feelings. And here's the truly sick part after it happened. A few times the other guests just got used to it. They learned to keep on eating, keep on drinking, keep on talking, while it was happening in the next room. A person can get used to almost anything if their life depends on it. And Caligula was showing them just how low they were willing to go to survive. The fourth phase took the private humiliation and made it a public show. Rome was crazy about its games. Gladiator fights, wild animal hunts, big plays. The Colosseum hadn't been built yet. That was still about 40 years away, but there were plenty of arenas where huge crowds gathered to watch violence for fun. Caligula took that tradition and twisted it into something much, much darker. At first, the games looked normal enough. Criminals fighting lions, gladiators battling to the death. But then Caligula started throwing curveballs. Halfway through a day of fights, he'd suddenly announced that the next match would feature members of the audience. Guards would just wade into the crowd, grab people at random, and shove them into the arena. No weapons, no training, just a regular person facing a professional killer or a starving lion. Their crime. Maybe they looked at him funny. Maybe they looked too rich. Or maybe they were just sitting in the wrong seat at the wrong time. There was no reason to it, no pattern, and that was the whole point. Anyone could be next at any moment for any reason. Or for no reason at all. But it got worse. The empire started running low on condemned prisoners, so Caligula just fixed the problem by changing the definition of who deserved to die. Petty criminals who should have just gotten a fine were now thrown to the beasts. Then it was people with no record at all. Just folks who said the wrong thing got accused by the wrong guy or just had the bad luck of catching the emperor's eye on a bad day. The games became a death lottery, and if you were part of the elite, you had to be there. Not showing up meant you were obviously plotting against him. But showing up meant you might be the next one dragged onto the sand to be torn apart for your neighbor's entertainment. Sometimes Caligula would just sit up in his imperial box, casually eating grapes and chatting, while men were ripped to shreds below. Sometimes he'd get bored and just leave in the middle of it all. Sometimes he'd laugh, and sometimes he wouldn't even look up from his lunch. The randomness was the point. When rules are clear, people can follow them to stay safe. But when the punishment is completely random, there are no rules. There's just fear and the desperate gnawing hope that today isn't your day. The fifth and final phase is what finally got him killed, but not before it showed just how casual, how everyday his cruelty had become. There was this guy named Cassius Chaerea. He was a high-ranking officer in the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguards. We're talking elite soldiers who stood inches away from Caligula every single day, fully armed, and trained their whole lives to kill. Now Chaerea had this one thing about him that Caligula thought was hilarious, a high-pitched voice. And Caligula, being Caligula, just couldn't let it go. Every day there was a new joke, a new insult, a new public humiliation. But here's the detail that shows you how routine this all was when it was Chaerea's turn to get the daily military password, a normal procedure done right in front of all the other guards. Caligula would give him words that were intentionally girly or dirty. Venus, Priapus, words designed to make all the other soldiers snicker at him, day after day, week after week, for months on end. To Caligula, it was nothing. A throwaway joke he probably forgot 2 seconds later. But for Chaerea, every single joke was another drop of poison seeping into his soul. Caligula had made a fatal mistake in his math. You could humiliate senators because they had too much to lose. They had kids, big houses, a family name to protect. They could tell themselves that just surviving was a noble act. But Chaerea was a soldier, a man who had been trained for violence since he was a boy. A man who stood next to the emperor every day with a sword on his hip, knowing exactly where the soft spots were. And Caligula had just spent months teaching this killer that a life under his rule wasn't a life worth living. But the machine, it made a mistake. It aimed its casual, everyday cruelty at the wrong guy. Not some suit trained to take it on the chin, not someone with a life to protect, but a man with absolutely nothing left to lose, and every single tool he needed to do something about it. What happens next unfolds in less than 60 seconds, but it would forever alter the course of Roman history. January 24th, 41 A.D. Caligula's at the theater, taking in a show. He's in a great mood, you know, laughing, tossing coins to the common folk. Around noon, he decides he's had enough and heads from the theater back to the palace, through a tight underground hallway. Picture it, rough stone on both sides, flickering torchlight, barely enough room for two people to walk shoulder to shoulder. And his enemies. They were waiting. As Caligula gets closer, Chaerea steps out to meet him. This is business as usual. A guard checking in, getting the daily password, giving a report. Caligula, wrapped up in his own godlike invincibility, completely oblivious to the storm, about to break, spits out one last sneering, sarcastic remark. It was the last thing he would ever say. Chaerea lets out a scream, a line that history can't quite pin down. Maybe it was, "Take this." Maybe "This is for Rome." Or maybe it was just a guttural roar of pure pent-up rage as he drove his sword deep under Caligula's ribs. Caligula stumbles. He tries to run, but the hallway is a trap, and there are men at both ends. They're on him in a second. The old texts say 30 stab wounds. 30 times the steel went in a symphony of vengeance against flesh and bone, releasing years of fury in one single explosive blast of violence. They didn't stop. Not until there was nothing left but a body that could no longer possibly hold a soul. 4 years of rage, of humiliation, of pure terror, all unleashed in 60 seconds of a frenzied, bloody ballet. The monster was dead. And that, my friends, is when everything got so much worse. The conspirators weren't finished with just Caligula. They tore through the palace, hunting down anyone with his name, anyone close to him. They found his wife, Caesonia. She knew. She could hear the screams bouncing off the marble halls. She was on her knees, begging, pleading with men whose hands were still slick with her husband's lifeblood. They ended her life right there in her own bedroom. Then they found the nursery. Caligula's little girl, Julia Drusilla, just 2 years old, maybe 3. She's crying for her mom. A soldier scoops her up. And as this terrified little girl is screaming confused, he swings her head first into a solid marble wall. They had to cut the line. You can't leave an heir who might grow up looking for payback. You can't leave a symbol for loyalists to rally around. So they murdered a child. This is what happens when the machine shatters. It doesn't just power down. It implodes, devouring every last piece of itself in one final convulsive act of violence. For a few hours, maybe for a whole afternoon, it felt like Rome might actually have a chance to breathe again. The Senate scrambled into an emergency session, and men who had been silent for 4 long years suddenly found their voices arguing for a return to the Republic, to get rid of this whole emperor experiment and go back to the old ways of shared limited power. For the first time in a generation, a real debate about the soul of Rome was happening. But while they were talking, the Praetorian Guard was ransacking the palace. They were just going room to room, grabbing jewels, gold, anything that shined. The emperor was dead. No one was in charge. It was a free-for-all. Then one soldier hears a noise from behind a curtain. He yanks it back and finds a man cowering there, middle-aged, shaking a man with a bad stutter and a limp that made him walk like a broken puppet. It was Claudius, Caligula's uncle, the family joke. Everyone just saw him as this harmless fool, probably a little slow from some sickness he had as a kid, kept around because he was too pitiful to ever be a threat. But the soldier, he looked at him and didn't see a fool. He saw a golden ticket. He saw a new emperor. And more importantly, he saw job security and a steady paycheck. The Praetorians hoisted Claudius onto their shoulders and paraded him to their camp. They declared him emperor, just like that. They didn't ask the Senate. They didn't have any legal right. They just did it because they had the swords to back it up. And while the Senate was still lost in its high-minded debate about the future of the Republic, the army had already decided the reality on the ground. There would be another emperor. The system wasn't dead. It was just getting the reboot. And here's the thing that still messes with historians 2,000 years later. Caligula's reign lasted less than 4 years. 3 years, 10 months, and 8 days if you want to get exact. In the grand sweep of Roman history, that's a blink of an eye, a footnote. And yet here we are still talking about him, still trying to get our heads around him, still using his name as the go-to word for a corrupt, insane tyrant. Why is that? Because Caligula proved something absolutely terrifying about power. He showed the world that the entire machinery of a state, all its laws, its armies, its money, its religion, its traditions, could be twisted into a personal weapon for one man's psychological torture games. He didn't break the system. He mastered it. He became the system. Those accounting books at the imperial brothel, that was just bureaucracy doing its job. The forced public mourning for his sister, that was just law enforcement doing its job. The random executions at the games, that was just public entertainment doing its job. The violation of senators' wives at his dinner parties, that was just imperial hospitality doing its job. Every single atrocity was by the book legal because he was the book. Every horror was administratively correct because he controlled the administration. The machine didn't break down. It worked perfectly exactly as it was designed to. It was just aimed straight at hell. And when he was gone, the system didn't just die with him. Nope. It just found a new guy to pull the levers. Just look at what crawled out of the woodwork after him. You had Nero literally lighting up his garden parties with Christians. Domitian offing senators because he didn't like their vibe. Commodus turning the Senate into his personal cheering squad, while he played gladiator, making the most powerful men in Rome clap for his sword fights. And then there was Elagabalus, doing things so twisted that even 2,000 years later, historians still can't find the right words for it. The blueprint was still there. The machine just kept upgrading itself because Caligula had let a terrifying secret out of the bag, a truth Rome could never forget, that when one person holds all the cards, when you can't tell where the man ends and the state begins, there is absolutely nothing to stop them, except a blade in the dark. No checks, no balances, no due process, just you waiting for them to croak or taking matters into your own hands, and even then the machine just finds another soul to chew up and spit out. The old historian Suetonius wrote that Caligula made the best servant and the absolute worst master. He learned tyranny by studying it from the inside out. He spent 6 long years playing the part of the perfect, obedient subject, all while he was secretly taking notes, soaking up every trick, every mind game, every single method of control and cruelty that Tiberius ever used. Then he perfected it. He systematized it. He turned it into a repeatable formula for breaking people. And that's the warning, isn't it? That's the lesson that's been screaming at us for 2 millennia. The greatest threats to our dignity don't show up looking like monsters. They learn, they adapt, they wear a mask of loyalty and normalcy right up until the second they don't need it anymore. But there's one more thing, one final disturbing detail that casts this whole story in an even darker shadow. After Claudius became emperor, he ordered most of Caligula's personal files to be torched. The letters, the official documents, the detailed ledgers, all of it gone. Up in smoke. The official histories we have now were written by guys like Suetonius and Tacitus, piecing things together decades later, from fragments, from memories, and from rumors. Which means everything you've just heard, the 5 phases. The systematic terror, the whole damn machine. That's just the stuff that slipped through the cracks. That's what was left. Asterisk after asterisk. They deliberately tried to scrub the worst of it from the history books. Just now think about that. Imagine what they burned. Imagine what was so horrifying that even in an empire that regularly crucified thousands, that fed people to wild animals for entertainment, that turned human agony into a spectator sport, they decided some things just needed to be erased. What was in those destroyed files? What details were considered too dangerous to keep? What techniques were so effective that they couldn't risk some future tyrant studying the playbook? Caligula ruled Rome for 3 years, 10 months, and 8 days. In that time, he built a machine that showed every dictator who followed exactly how to break human beings systematically, psychologically, completely. He showed them how to turn normal government agencies into weapons of terror, how to make people complicit in their own ruin, how to destroy dignity while leaving the body alive. And that blueprint never disappeared. It's still out there, hiding in the historical record in the patterns of power that repeat across centuries. Every totalitarian regime that followed, whether they knew it or not, was ripping pages straight from Caligula's playbook. The show trials, the forced confessions turning victims into accomplices, the random violence designed to keep everyone off balance, twisting normal bureaucracy into a factory of oppression. All of it traces back to that narrow hallway 2,000 years ago, where a high-ranking soldier finally had enough. The machine Caligula built lasted less than 4 years in his hands, but the knowledge of how to build it, the proof that it could work, the demonstration of just how far human systems could be perverted, that legacy is eternal. Which leaves one final question hanging in the air, the one we're almost afraid to ask. If one man, in less than 4 years, could architect this level of systematic horror using ancient technology and pre-industrial paperwork, what could someone with modern tools pull off? What would Caligula's machine look like, with computers, surveillance systems, algorithmic control, and the power to watch every citizen's every move? The ancient Romans couldn't answer that question. Honestly, neither can we. But the fact that we have to ask it, that we're still trying to wrap our heads around how one human being built a system so effective at crushing the human spirit, suggests that Caligula's real victory wasn't in what he did to Rome. It was in proving that it could be done at all, that the machine could be built, that normal people could be turned into cogs in a machine of systematic cruelty just by changing the incentives and removing the guardrails. That's the horror that survived 2,000 years. Not the specific acts as terrible as they were, but the knowledge that somewhere in our social DNA there's a blueprint for a suffering machine. And once someone discovers it, once someone shows that it works, that knowledge becomes a permanent part of the human toolkit. Caligula died in that corridor in 41 AD. The machine he built outlived him by centuries, and in some form, in some corner of human civilization, it's still running today. The only question is whether we're living inside it without realizing it, just smiling and nodding at our own dinner parties, while something essential is slowly being taken away from us.